you so much for coming to my intern presentation. I really appreciate all of you being here today. In case you couldn't tell by now, I'm going to talk about Venezuela, probably my favorite topic in the whole world. It is where I was born and raised, so get ready, I'm going to dive right in. Can anyone tell me what the combination of these items could make? Any guesses? Very close, yes. So if you were about to guess a mask to protect yourself against tear gas, congratulations, you guessed correctly. If you are wondering what the glove was for, that's what you use to pick the tear gas up and throw it back at the military, or away from you at the very least. So this is common knowledge in Venezuela. We live protests and therefore a lot of tear gas every single day. This is happening because Venezuela is going through the worst crisis it has experienced in modern history. So for the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through that crisis. Don't worry, it won't all be depressing. I'm also going to tell you about how different digital tools and channels have enabled Venezuelans to become empowered, share their message beyond the boundaries of the country, and turn a local movement into a globalized cause. So first things first, Venezuela sits at the top of the South American continent. It has a population of 30 million people, and the country itself, the size is comparable to that of Texas. It's slightly bigger. I was born in Caracas, the capital city. It has a population of approximately 8 million people, most of which live in shanty towns like the ones you see here. We call them barrios. Caracas is divided by class. As you can see from this image, you can tell the difference between people who are doing a little bit better off and those who live in poverty and extreme poverty. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the population lives in extreme poverty. This generates a series of complications. It's a very complex situation. It mushrooms into a lot of different issues, creating the crisis I'm about to tell you about. So the Venezuelan crisis is a three-part crisis. It has to do with the political situation, the economic situation, the social situation we're currently experiencing. I'm going to walk you through the political side of things very quickly. When I was 8 years old, Hugo Chavez Frias was elected. This is probably the image that comes into your minds when you think about Venezuela. Shortly after being elected, he installed what's known as the socialism of the 21st century, which essentially turned the longest democracy in South America into a communist state. Shortly after being elected, Chavez changed the constitution several times to change the country's name, allowing people to be re-elected indefinitely, getting rid of the separation of powers, eliminating Congress for that matter, 100%. So if you by any chance read Orwell's Animal Farm, you can start drawing parallels. Clearly what happened. Chavez passed away in 2013, officially. It was actually December 2012, but that's between us. And he requested his followers to please vote for Maduro as his successor. Maduro began his political career in 2006 after being the unofficial union leader for bus drivers. He was also a bodyguard for one of Chavez's inner circle members, then himself becoming part of that inner circle. He has very strong relations with Cuba, which is why it was in Chavez's best interest, as well as the Castro's brothers, to keep this relationship alive. Very little experience and lacks the charisma that Chavez had and the strategic thinking that he had. So there are three main issues that stem from this political problem. The first one has to do with education, particularly indoctrination. So when I was going to school, I had to take classes such as military education and Bolivarian education. Bolivarian coming from the Bolivarian Revolution that Chavez created. These kids who go to public schools have it much worse. They don't know anything other than the militia uniform and to love Chavez above all things. Reverting that is very complicated. Moving on, we have the media control. When Chavez was elected, the government had one official radio station and one official TV station. Now the government controls all stations, TV and radio. They've shut down more than 40 radio stations and several TV stations for portraying the government under a bad light. And Chavez used to do this. Maduro is following his footsteps. During prime time, they do what's called a national broadcast. The name in Spanish is cadenas, which translates into chains, and they just talk from anywhere from 3 to 8, 10 hours at a time. so the only message you receive is coming straight from the government. They do this particularly whenever there's a protest happening or a severe situation that they're trying to cover up. So it's very hard to get information that is not coming straight from the government. Last but not least, opposing the government is officially a crime. We have several political prisoners. Leopoldo Lopez, pictured here, he's an opposition leader. He's been in jail since February 18th this year. But I think the problem here goes beyond idols like Leopoldo Lopez. Students who are protesting by the hundreds every day are arrested, and then they are tortured by the guards. They are severely beaten, they're denied food or water, and then they're applied electricity for information or just straight up install good old-fashioned fear. So that's for politics. Now we're going to move on to economics. We have the highest inflation in the world at 60.9%. 60.9. Let that sink in. That's huge. The U.S. inflation is at 2.1%, just to contrast. So this very high inflation has led to a whole new series of problems. We have food shortages and home and goods shortages. All these items you won't be able to find on the supermarket. Note the toilet paper. Not only is this incredibly inconvenient, but the paper crisis goes beyond just toilet paper. Newspapers have stopped printing or had to cut down in pages, eliminate circulation because there's not enough paper to print them. This benefits the government, so they're doing very little or nothing to change this. This next image you're probably familiar with. It is Black Fridays, and it's taken in the US, by the way. Black Fridays outside of a Macy's. People standing in line for hours to purchase perhaps a product that they've already thought that they need. I show you this because this is also the reality every single day in Venezuela to go to the supermarket. People stand in line for hours. They usually last about 6 hours on average. So instead of going to work, people are lining up to get just one product. For instance, in this supermarket, perhaps milk has just arrived. So people will line up, and then after they're done here, they'll go down the street to line up again to get flour. Once they're outside, they are marked to try to control the chaos, and on their way out, they're marked again to indicate that they've purchased the 1 unit that they're allowed to get of whatever item they're there to purchase. And sadly, once you step into the supermarkets, this is what you see. So I think these images do a great job in explaining what this economic crisis looks and feels like for Venezuelans. Last but not least, we have a social crisis, and I think within the social crisis, the most important fact to mention is the crime wave that we're experiencing. Things have never been worse in the Venezuelan streets. So when I was doing the equivalent of high school in Venezuela, I couldn't leave my house anymore without letting my parents know that I was out and about. And whenever I got to whatever destination I was headed to, say school, for example, I had to notify them that I had arrived. That's because whenever you leave your home, you're not guaranteed that you're going to come back. The situation is very, very, very dangerous. If you are caught outside of your home at night, it is recommended that you stay wherever you are, sleep over, do not use the roads. If you are caught driving at night, you can't use your turn signals, you can't stop at red lights because it will indicate to potential kidnappers who will be following you which direction you're going and give them opportunities to get you. Perhaps the last piece of information I can share with you on this is the fact that I don't know a single Venezuelan who's lived in Venezuela and not stared down the barrel of a gun at some point in their lives. Caracas, the capital city, has the second highest murder and kidnap rate in the world. So 1 person is killed in Venezuela every 20 minutes. Statistically speaking then, by the time I'm done with this presentation, a person would have lost their lives to violence in Caracas. So things are happening. Sorry for bringing everyone down, but this entire crisis has led to a series of protests to begin. This is not new. People have been protesting in Venezuela throughout the 15 years that this government has existed. But there are key differences when you compare these protests to 5, 10 years ago. First, there's never been this level of desperation because things have never been worse. Secondly, the military oppression has never been so blatant. Students are getting killed on the streets, and if they're caught and remain alive, they are tortured. But the most significant difference, I think, is the fact that we now have digital tools and channels that did not exist before. These digital tools allow the public, both within Venezuela and the rest of the world, to become informed. And that is what brings me hope. When I think about this new wave of protest, I think about the power that digital has to spread a message beyond anything we have ever imagined. The reach is unprecedented, and it really empowers people. It allows the cause to reach an international level, bringing momentum back to the protest, and then letting the government know that they are being watched, so they need to apply free restrictions. So to exemplify this difference, just from April 2013 to April 2014, you can see the increase in internet users by the millions in Venezuela. We lead the world in increase of internet usage. Just last year alone, that percentage change you saw represents 63.3%. That is very significant. Imagine what that means, the amount of people who are getting information that was previously unavailable. That is very empowering. Journalists who've lost their jobs, people who live in exile are starting blogs and websites. Some of them are exclusively in English, like Caracas Chronicles. If you're interested, the URL is caracaschronicles.org. So they are dedicating time to inform those who live outside of Venezuela and are not familiar with the problems we are experiencing. Another key difference is the fact that protesters are using their cell phones as their weapons, essentially. They document human rights violations. The picture up here is when Leopoldo Lopez was taken into custody in February. And then they share those images through their social channels. So yes, social media is crucial for this movement. We use Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr for several different things, but Twitter has definitely been the protagonist for this particular movement. Especially this hashtag SOS Venezuela, perhaps some of you are already familiar with it, but that hashtag alone has been revolutionary for the movement. This is how we usually use it. Someone documents human rights violations and tweets about it, and that tweet travels far beyond we ever expected. This is an image taken from social listening tool Systemos, indicating different places around the world where the hashtag was used in the last 6 months. The hashtag was used 9.7 million times. Again, super significant for the cause. We've never seen anything like this before. This second image is taken from techchange.org, and it indicates places where people began protesting in solidarity to those protests taking place in Venezuela. So not only are people becoming informed about the crisis, they are actively taking action is a bit redundant, but they're becoming involved. This is what those protests look like, and they come straight from that hashtag, and then they're spread again throughout the internet world. Celebrities began picking it up. DJ Steve Aoki has taken that little sign virtually to every single concert he's had this year. Kevin Spacey wrote an entire article titled SOS Venezuela for his personal website. And then people began creating their own hashtags like I'm Your Voice Venezuela, taking pictures of themselves, and again, forming part of the movement, which is unprecedented in Venezuelan modern history. We've used social media with mobile applications that didn't exist even 2 years ago. Stello is an excellent example. It was developed in Austin, Texas, and it turns your phone into a walkie-talkie, pretty simple. It allows you to create channels where thousands and thousands of people can join, and it was first used between the protesters alone, so they would organize themselves using the walkie-talkies, but now people who are monitoring, not necessarily who are participating on the streets, but they are just monitoring social media activity, they've been able to warn protesters about potential militia and military ambushes, saving hundreds of them. And from this slide behind me, you can tell that Stello themselves have become involved with the movement. Whenever they track any issues with access, they make sure to get more information, they provide solutions, so they're right there with us. We are starting to see hints of tangible results, again for the first time in recent history for Venezuela. The UN is perhaps the most obvious example. The human rights representatives called out the Venezuelan government, so letting them know that they're being watched, that they're not okay with all the things that are taking place in the protests. And again, this is just a very small piece of result, but it's a lot more than what we've experienced recently. Another example, which happened actually last Wednesday, is the fact that the U.S. Department of State decided to apply visa restrictions to human rights abusers in Venezuela. The list they published constitutes 100% the highest ranking member of the government and the highest ranking members of the military. So again, hints of tangible solutions that we're experiencing for the first time, which is very empowering for those who are still taking the streets protesting. Digital tools are being used everywhere in the world, fueled by that global connectivity that didn't exist just a few years ago. One example is blogger Joanny Sanchez. She's from Cuba. She has perhaps one of the very first blogs that chronicle life in communist Cuba, and she's able to publish this blog despite extreme censorship because she emails her stories to people who live outside of Cuba, and they post it on her blog for her. The blog is called Generation Y, if you're interested. She also has a great Twitter handle with approximately 630,000 followers. Another example took place in the protests in Turkey. They were using this virtual private network called Hotspot Shield, which allowed them to bypass censorship, access sites like Facebook or Twitter after they've been blocked, and share information anonymously online. The last example, which I think is very empowering, is internet.org, which is formed by these companies you see up here: Facebook, Nokia, Ericsson are just a few examples. They launched their first mobile application last week, and this mobile app lets people, it launched in African countries at first, but they're planning to expand it throughout the developing world. It gives free internet access to people for specific services like Facebook, Messenger, Wikipedia, job search engine, but it's given people, specifically women in African countries, access to information that they didn't have before, including women's rights. They have access to the women's rights application, and they get child care information, health information, things that are very important for their everyday lives that they didn't have access to previously. So now, to begin to wrap up and going back to the Venezuelan example, I can't tell you how this is all going to end. I have no idea what the outcome of this will all be. But what I can tell you with full certainty is the fact that digital has changed the landscape. And that change has been very significant for us Venezuelans. Not only it is the first time in our history that we're able to stand up against an almighty, all-powerful, all-controlling government, but we've able to amplify our cause and our message beyond Venezuela, turn it into a global cause, which again is extremely empowering. So now the few items that you're going to see behind me are different ways, should you feel compelled to, that you can help keep the movement alive. You can do something as easy as just Googling Venezuela, learning a little bit about the most recent developments in the protests or the crisis itself. You can share this information on your social media. You can even just tweet hashtag SOS Venezuela. Whatever you do may seem small, but it's a drop in an ocean that is really, I have no words to convey how empowering that has been. It's amazing that digital allows this global connectivity to exist, taking a message beyond borders. That message hopefully drives action, and that action has had the potential to make significant change, even if that change happens thousands of miles away. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll just ask what questions are there for me this afternoon.
You mentioned the rise in internet users by a percentage amount. What constitutes, like the total population, how many of those people are now internet users?
About 10 million.
What percentage of the entire population?
That's a third of the
Okay.
population, approximately. Yeah.
How do people get access to like phones and I just think of the basic necessities are hard to get a hold of. Are family members sending them, or people outside of the country like sending them phones, or how does that work?
That is an excellent question. Yes, there may be some unblocked cell phones that come from places other than Venezuela, and the internet company is run by the government, so access is always an issue. But that's why that relationship with the outside world is so important for people who are still there.
Do you still have them?
Yes.
How do you keep in contact with them? What is
WhatsApp is
Okay.
probably the main way we communicate, and then FaceTime, Skype, whenever they do have internet access.
Any other questions?
Are you going back?
Not for a long time, probably. I'm open to admit. Hopefully sooner than later though. I really wanna go back.
When was the last time you went?
Maybe a little bit over 2 years ago, so not that long. It still feels like a very, very long time. Did everyone try the food? Make sure you eat.
Do you want comments now?
Sure.
I mean, it's such a heady topic, and I think you presented it in such a powerful way. I think it's hard for any of us here to wrap our heads around what life like that is like, and I think the way that you outlined it and walked us through it made us understand the gravity of the situation. But I think the way that you told us, what to expect, down the line, and how social media, how you tied it to planning and digital, I think was a great way to have that light at the end of the tunnel connected to what we do and why it matters. Because I think a lot of the times social media is light and fun and we all enjoy it, but there are obviously other uses for it that are more important and meaningful. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you for listening.
You're a great presenter.
Thanks.
I mean, I know we've kind of talked a little bit before about like how dark I guess some of the middle section was, and I think you did a very good job of kind of pulling us up into what you see as a tool that can help change things. And I think it's also really important, or at least I was feeling really the importance, just back to the work we do, of not just like reach, because I know the impressions that you put up there, 9.7 million. It's remarkable, but if you're thinking about, the amount of people putting into that campaign and so on, you might not think it's that impactful, but it's really the resonance and the response that you get from that I think is really cool. And really great thing to just keep in mind as we do our campaigns.
A few years ago, there was another intern here from Venezuela, Sophia, and she reported, I guess it may have been like 3 years ago, so it was before things were even that bad. And I want to say her presentation covered ways of marketing, kind of drumming up a collective, way to organize and using the different tools that are out there, and just thinking of all of the different apps and programs available now that can further that. I think it's really interesting to compare from then till now, and I'd imagine it only continues. That's good news.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what her presentation was
So
like.
yeah, I remember it for sure.
Thank you.
So stylistically, I like the one. I mean, about halfway through I started counting, and you only had like 9 words total. And you made the presentation huge, because it is a huge issue. And the way you actually wrapped it up and pulled digital into it was to make it more human and show the story. So just stylistically, I thought you did a wonderful job. And then content, you actually took a very meaty, substantive, and very personal topic and made it relatable to all of us, which is very, very hard to do. And I thought you did a great job. So
Thank you.
thank you for your take was very good.
Yeah, I think you did anything wrong.
Thanks. I'm glad.
I think you're very knowledgeable, obviously, about the topic, but I didn't feel like you memorized anything. Like you just know it, and really, really good presentation.
Thanks.
Where are these from? Did you make them, or did you want to?
Yes, I'm here. They come from Mesa One. It's a great Venezuelan restaurant here in Dallas. I left some cards on the table. Actually, the most authentic Venezuelan food I've had in the U.S. yet, so highly recommend it.
What are some staples of the Venezuelan diet? I mean, when you have groceries available to you.
Cheese. Cheese is probably the main ingredient on everything. And then corn flour. I had a little image of it up on my slide. That's what we make. Two of the most traditional dishes, arepas and cachapas, which are essentially corn flour patties that you put cheese on.